Join me tonight on Twitch at 11:30 p.m. Eastern at the conclusion of Sunday Night Football, where we'll talk about everything that happened in Week 8 of the NFL season. Plus, I'll have my thoughts on today's extremely early Jaguars game. Link to join below. And now, on with our feature presentation. Whenever a game is being played, there are many things that decide the outcome, from coaching adjustments, to players executing, to even how the teams respond to the weather, and some calls by the officials. However, the one thing that you don't want to have happen is to have the field itself decide the game. The game itself should be played on a field that doesn't cause injuries or lends itself to be potentially dangerous. The game itself should be played on a field where you don't have to adjust your game plan solely based on flaws with the field. As in an absolutely extreme hypothetical, you're a team that likes to throw the ball down the sidelines, but you can't this game because the sidelines are sinkholes. And the game itself should be played on a field where you can actually play football. In other words, the game shouldn't be played on, well, whatever the heck this is. When this video drops, it's dropping on the same night that the Green Bay Packers are playing the Buffalo Bills. And I can reasonably assure you that no matter what the weather is, or what the grounds crew does beforehand, that there's no way it can look anything like what it looked like when the teams played in 1982. Because in 1982, when the Packers played the Bills over at Milwaukee County Stadium in an absolutely big game, it was played on a field so poorly kept that both the Packers and Bills criticized the stadium officials afterwards for their negligence, with Bills head coach Chuck Knox saying, quite bluntly, "It was murder. In this day and age, you shouldn't have to play a game under these conditions." That's saying a lot, and today, we're taking a deep dive into why that was the case. Because this is the story behind what has to be, at the very least, in the discussion for the worst field in NFL history. Before I talk about the actual field in question, and just how much of a disaster it was, we need some context to understand the importance of this game, as well as the many, and I truly mean many things and circumstances that led us to this point where this game was being played on a giant mud pit. It's December 5th, 1982. It's week 5 of the strike-shortened 9-game season, and as we hit the official halfway point of this abbreviated year, we have an interconference matchup on our hands over in Milwaukee between the Green Bay Packers and the Buffalo Bills. To say that this game was a big one for both of these teams would be an understatement. On paper, this was looking like one of the biggest and best games of the entire week. With 16 teams out of 28 making the playoffs, you had to figure that if you hit the halfway point of the season and you had 4 wins, you were pretty much in, barring a massive collapse or an unforeseen event. And with this game, you had 2 teams who were sitting pretty at 3-1, knowing that a win would all but clinch a playoff spot for them, and knowing that a win would go a long way in helping them host one of those first-round games. You had the Green Bay Packers, who look like one of the best teams in football, boasting the best point differential in the NFC and the second best point differential in the NFL at plus 37. And boasting one of the best offenses in football, which was 4th in the league at the time in scoring, thanks to the great play of quarterback Lynn Dickey, and some of the best talent ever assembled in the passing game, with the dynamic duo at wide receiver of John Jefferson and James Lofton, and Paul Kaufman at tight end. As a side note, to learn more about the career of Paul Kaufman, click the card in the upper right corner. And you had the Buffalo Bills, who were doing great things thanks to an incredible defense that had given up a league-best 40 points, allowing just 10 points per game, and held their opponents to single digits in 3 of their 4 games, including a shutout 20-0 victory over the Baltimore Colts the week before. In other words, this was a big game, and was looking on paper like it was going to be a great matchup. However, this game was scheduled to be played in Milwaukee at Milwaukee County Stadium, as the Packers had an agreement to play some of their schedule there instead of in Green Bay at Lambeau Field. To learn more about why that was the case, click the card in the upper right corner. Now, the obvious downside to this is that unlike Lambeau Field, where the Packers are the only tenant, when the Packers played at Milwaukee County Stadium, they shared the venue with the Milwaukee Brewers of Major League Baseball, so there were obviously going to be some issues with that. However, this game was being played in December, well past the end of baseball season. So any of the typical issues with a multi-purpose stadium regarding the field and having to maintain it for both football and baseball, especially with the infield dirt, shouldn't be a problem by this point in the year, right? Even if the field might have been somewhat of a hot mess at times during baseball season, now that baseball season is over, in theory, those problems were gone, since NFL rules require stadiums to sod the infield immediately after the season ends. Well, not quite. Because there were a whole host of things that made this year's situation in Milwaukee, and in particular, this game in Milwaukee, way different than any others. Number 1, and the giant elephant in the room, there was the strike. I've talked at length about the strike on this channel before, so I'm not going to dive too much into the details, as if you want to learn more about that, you can do so by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, the strike shut the season down for 57 days, and there was a genuine uncertainty after week 2 as to whether or not a deal was going to be done in order to play the games again. It was not like 1987, when you knew that the games were going on during the strike and that the break in the action wouldn't take long, even if it wasn't technically with NFL players. In 1982, there was a high probability and a fear that the sides were so far apart that the season would not resume again. Because of this, the NFL relaxed its rules regarding the sodding of stadiums after baseball season. We're not going to force stadiums to sod since, quite frankly, we have no idea if we're even going to play again. While the NFL never officially put out a statement saying that groundskeepers had free rein to not sod their facility, there was somewhat of an understanding, according to league spokesman Dick Maxwell, that due to the strike and the uncertainty surrounding it, they were just going to look the other way and relax their policy as a one-time thing. However, even if Milwaukee County Stadium officials were planning on sodding, and from all accounts, they were, there was a little something that got in the way of them being able to do that. And that was the fact that the primary tenant of the stadium had a little something to say about that. For most teams in Major League Baseball, the season usually ends around the end of September or the very beginning of October. In a normal world, the Brewers would have ended their home slate of games on September 26th. But in 1982, that was not the case for the Milwaukee Brewers at all. Because in 1982, despite only making it to the playoffs once in franchise history before, the Brewers shocked a ton of people when, after a 22-24 start leading to the firing of manager Buck Rogers and leading to the team being 8.5 games back of the division lead in the middle of June, they completely turned their season around as they won the AL East for the first time in franchise history in a full season. They beat the California Angels in the ALCS, and then played the St. Louis Cardinals in the World Series, taking the Cardinals to 7 games before losing 4-3. At the time of this video, it remains the only time in franchise history that the Milwaukee Brewers have ever made it to the World Series. The good news for Milwaukee, obviously, was that their team was the American League champions, and went on a run for the ages that truly came out of nowhere. And obviously, this meant more money for Milwaukee County Stadium in the form of parking and concessions and all of that, since there were extra games being played there. However, it came with a downside. Because the bad news for stadium officials in Milwaukee was that this incredible run by their hometown team meant that they couldn't start sodding until their season came to an end, meaning that they were weeks behind schedule, and these were weeks that, as we'll find out, they could not afford to lose whatsoever. And then, when the stadium officials wanted to begin sodding and making the field more suitable for football again, they couldn't do that because the weather was so horrible. Remember, this is Milwaukee that we're talking about. This is not a southern city. This is a city that will get cold rain and snow around the middle of October in some years. And right after the end of baseball season in 1982, the weather in Milwaukee was particularly horrible, as in worse than usual and worse than anticipated. At one point during the strike, a cold storm hit Milwaukee that was so bad that not only did it produce a wind chill factor of 0, but it produced 52-mile-per-hour winds and a temperature drop of 15 degrees in less than an hour. And this bad weather was one of the key storylines in the World Series that year when it came to games played in Milwaukee, as the weather was so bad that the ball was not bouncing the way that it normally does in the infield, leading to many players, especially on the Brewers, struggling to field normally routine plays, as you can see. One player said, "This is one of the worst infields in the league. There were a lot of high hops. You don't really know what to expect the ball to do." Another player said, in a Captain Obvious moment, it was kinda bad out there. So the field was already in bad condition, and now the officials physically could not sod it because of how bad the weather was, both in terms of the rain and in terms of the cold temperatures. As William R. Anderson, the stadium manager at Milwaukee County Stadium, said on this, it got real cold, and we couldn't do any sodding. When the weather got better, the football strike was on, and then it was too late to get sod. If we could have gotten the sod on, it would never have taken root. Translation, the field was screwed. There was nothing that could be done about it. So when you combine the strike delaying matters, the Brewers having their season go on longer than normal due to a World Series run, and awful weather in Milwaukee after baseball season, and after the strike that made it physically impossible to do anything whatsoever to improve the field conditions, and rain on the actual day of the game in question, you are left with, well, this.
Look at that. That is no fun to play in, basically because you can't play your game.
It's going to get to a point, especially for those who are busy today and getting several carries, where we will not be able to see their numbers at all.
As you can see, this game between the Packers and the Bills was played on a field that barely resembled a football field. The infield was just a liquid pit of mud by the end of it. Whatever your 40 time was probably doubled, because it was like running in quicksand with how impossible it was to find your footing and how deep the mud got. If your jersey wasn't covered in mud, and if you weren't completely unidentifiable by the end of the game, you weren't doing something right, or you weren't playing at all, because the conditions were that bad. This is an actual shot of one of the players during the game. Nothing is blurred out or digitally altered in any way. I can tell he plays for the Bills only because of his helmet. I can't tell you who that is, what number he wears, or what position he plays. The Bills wore white jerseys on this day, and I can tell you, that jersey does not have a speck of white on it. It is that obliterated in mud. And that was the norm throughout the game. I'm going to get to the post-game comments in just a bit, because both parties had quite a lot to say about this abomination of a field. But let's talk about the game really quickly before we do that. And as you can probably expect based on watching these highlights, when all was said and done, the Packers defended their home field and came out on top. And they won this one by a final score of 33-21. Although the game wasn't that close in actuality, as Green Bay led it 30-7 with 6 minutes left in the fourth quarter, which was a 4-possession game back in 1982, as the 2-point conversion did not exist. Green Bay's passing defense really came to play on this day, as the normally good Joe Ferguson struggled pretty badly, going 14 for 29, completing less than 50% of his passes, throwing 2 interceptions, and posting a passer rating of 44.3. Buffalo couldn't hold on to the ball whatsoever, turning it over 5 times, including 4 times in the first quarter alone. Green Bay's offensive line had a great game in pass protection, as even though a lot of players went to the ground on this money day, one player who was able to keep his jersey relatively clean was Lynn Dickey, as he did not get sacked once. And special teams played a part in this game as well. While Efrain Herrera went 0 for 2 kicking field goals for the Bills, somehow, despite the field being a complete mess that made it almost impossible to find your footing, Jan Stenerud went 4 for 5 for the Packers. But after the game, all the talk, and understandably so, was about how absolutely terrible the field conditions were. Because both members of the Packers and members of the Bills agreed that what transpired out there was completely unacceptable, and that Milwaukee County Stadium officials should be ashamed of themselves for how bad it was out there. I talked about Chuck Knox's murder quote at the top of the video, and rest assured, he was not the only person who spoke out about this. Far from it. Kicker Jan Stenerud was in absolute disbelief that he made 4 field goals, saying, "I could very easily have gone 0 for 5. I was surprised every time I made one. I'm at a real disadvantage on a field like this because I plant my left foot harder than most kickers. Believe me, I was scared to death out there." Buffalo quarterback Joe Ferguson said, "The field seemed to hurt us more than them because we're used to artificial turf." Running back Joe Cribbs said that the ball was so slippery and muddy because of the field that he couldn't play at full speed, saying, "I couldn't make my normal cuts today. because I had to hold the ball with 2 hands. Green Bay offensive tackle Greg Koch said, once you got in that mud, you had to get out. Their offensive linemen couldn't get their feet set for run blocking, and our pass rushers would have been slipping and sliding. Green Bay quarterback Lynn Dickey said that this was the worst field he ever played on, and added, you just stepped in it, and it went 3 inches over your shoes. Buffalo running back Curtis Brown said, when you're playing on a baseball diamond, and it rains like that, you know the field is going to be terrible. But I didn't think it was going to be that bad. But of all the critics, and trust me, there were many, as not a single person had a good thing to say about the field, none were more vocal than Packers head coach Bart Starr. Because to say that he was fed up with having to have his team play on that mess would be putting it lightly. Starr accused the Milwaukee County Stadium officials of just about everything under the sun, saying, they're supposed to have this field sodded at the earliest time following the close of the baseball season. I don't know what happened. You'll have to find out from the Stadium Commission, but I am very upset about it. You can see what inclement conditions can do. It's very, very unfortunate to have to put up with that mess in these days and these times. The ball game could have been decided by the weather, and that would have been a tragic happening. On one hand, I completely get where Starr is coming from. On the other hand, I find it incredibly ironic and laughable that Starr is saying how unfortunate it was that a game could be decided by the weather, and he played in arguably the most iconic bad weather game of all time, playing in and winning the Ice Bowl. But Starr was so upset about this that even the next day, with a chance to cool off, he was still going at it, accusing the county of disobeying the NFL's rules, and saying, I am concerned that someone is not more attentive to our needs there. In other words, in this incredibly important battle between 2 teams at 3-1, the field conditions were so bad that they overtook the game itself as the real story. That's when you know it's bad. Today, the Green Bay Packers play all of their games in Green Bay at Lambeau Field, and no team shares a stadium with a baseball team, so there is a highly likely chance that we will never see anything like this ever happening again. But for the Packers and the Bills in 1982, this was the reality that they had to deal with on this day. Because for sports fans in the state of Wisconsin, one man's treasure, as in the Brewers going on an improbable run to the World Series by winning the American League, was another man's trash, as in arguably the worst field in the over 100-year history of the National Football League. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9. To see college football videos, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.